Tank warfare manuals do not have a chapter on how to turn your own engine into a chemical weapon. They do not write about what to do when your ammo rack is empty and the barrels of German Tigers are staring you down at point-blank range. This crew committed an act that any tribunal would classify as sabotage and the destruction of entrusted equipment. They voluntarily locked themselves in a scorching gas chamber to unleash a hell upon the enemy that no front line had ever seen. Why did 8 brand-new German machines suddenly start shooting each other while a captured Russian tank remained standing with a cold gun? Learn the history of a feat that was officially written off as a statistical error. October 1942. The Rzhev salient. The square designated on staff maps as Hill 204.6, and in soldiers' letters that never made it past the censors, simply as the Valley of Death. There was no horizon here. Only a gray, ragged veil of rain, mixing the sky and earth into a single muddy mess. The clay here had a specific greasy sheen, and the smell of iron, because there was more metal in the soil than humus. A captured Panzerkampfwagen 4, modification F, was sitting in this clay up to its fenders. 22 tons of German steel, created for blitzkriegs on European highways, proved powerless against the Russian autumn thaw. Broad tracks, designed to distribute pressure on the ground, were now working like anchors. The machine did not move. It trembled. The 12-cylinder Maybach engine was idling, choking and sneezing. Captured equipment is temperamental. It cannot digest the surrogate gasoline and low-grade oil that supplied this doomed sector. The vibration of the hull transmitted into the spines of the crew sitting inside. This was not the tremble of power. It was the agony of a mechanism. Inside the turret hung a heavy, stagnant air. A mixture of smells: burnt transmission fluid, unwashed bodies, wet wool greatcoats, and the sweet, nauseating aroma of German synthetic leather that upholstered the seats. But the worst smell of all was emptiness. The ammo rack was empty. 75 millimeters of the long-barreled KWK-40 gun stared into nowhere. In the breech, emptiness. In the crates underfoot, emptiness. The last armor-piercing shell had gone into the void 2 hours ago, ricocheting off the glacis plate of a self-propelled gun. The supply convoy that was supposed to break through to them along the log road had turned into a burning pile of wood and meat 3 kilometers back. The Junkers had done their job cleanly, surgically, leaving the crew of the captured machine alone with the physics of war. Master Sergeant Kovalev sat in the commander's seat, pressing his forehead against the cold triplex glass. The glass had fogged up. He wiped it with the sleeve of his oily, quilted jacket. Outside, the world was monochrome. Gray rain, black mud, whitish flashes of explosions somewhere on the flank. Kovalev felt no fear. Fear is an emotion, and emotions burn calories, which he hadn't had for 2 days. The cold calculator of an engineer was working in his head. Given 1 immobile tank. Remaining fuel in the tanks, critical, the needle lying on 0, twitching in time with the engine's misfires. Ammunition, 0.0. Crew, 4 men, exhausted to the state of biological robots. Comrade Sergeant, the voice of the loader, Semyonov, broke into a squeal. "Comrade Sergeant, they are..." Semyonov was young. He was shaking. It was a purely physiological reaction. Adrenaline intoxication. Pupils dilated, breathing shallow, hands living their own lives, scratching the breech of the gun. He wasn't looking forward at the enemy. He was looking back. Through the rear vision slits of the turret. There, a mile and a half behind, in the fog, the predatory silhouettes of Soviet ZS-3 anti-tank guns could be made out. The crews of the neighboring battery were peering into the veil of rain. For them, the situation was crystal clear. There was a German tank in the neutral zone. The silhouette of the four, with the characteristic right angles of the turret and the muzzle brake, was impossible to confuse with anything else. The red stars, hastily painted with a brush on the sides and turret 3 weeks ago, had vanished. The Rzhev clay flying from under the tracks had worked as perfect camouflage, but not for the enemy, against their own. The mud had plastered over the identification marks with a thick, impenetrable layer. Now, for the gunners of the Ziddis cannons, they were simply a target, a mark. An enemy that had frozen for some reason, possibly preparing to fire. "Stop the hysterics." Kovalev's voice sounded dry, like cracking dead wood. No notes of sympathy. "Watch your sector." "What sector?" Semenov was almost screaming. "Our own guys are going to burn us. They're aiming. I see them traversing the trails. We need to get out. We need to wave." "You get out, you catch a sniper's bullet. Sit down." Kovalev knew what he was saying. The neutral strip was swept by fire. Any movement of a hatch, and lead would drum against the armor. And if not a sniper, then shrapnel. The air outside was saturated with metal. The artillery cannonade didn't cease for a minute, creating a constant background hum that pressed on eardrums until they bled. In the headphones of his helmet, the ether crackled. Through static discharges and Russian curses, foreign speech broke through. Hard, barking, rhythmic. The German tankers were working in the open clear. "Achtung, Achtung! Panzerspitze, vorwärts! Marsch, Marsch!" Kovalev knew German. Technical German. Operating instructions, engine schematics, part markings. This was enough to understand. A breakthrough was underway. Heavy armor. Judging by the timbre of the engines, which he picked up even through the armor, these were not 3s and not 4s like theirs. A low, guttural roar that vibrated the diaphragm. Tigers. They were coming straight at them. The situation was resolving into a perfect geometric dead end. The trap had snapped shut. In front, heavy tanks of the Wehrmacht that would crush their captured tin can without even noticing. The armor of the 4, 50 millimeters in the front, was cardboard to the 88 millimeter gun of a Tiger. Behind, their own artillerymen, who were already turning the elevation wheels, catching the black silhouette with the German cross under the mud in their crosshairs. A sub-caliber shell from a Zis-3 would stitch through their stern and ignite the gasoline fumes in a fraction of a second. They were strangers to everyone. A lonely steel box in the middle of a field of death, filled with 4 dead men walking. The driver mechanic down below was struggling with the levers. He was trying to rock the machine, engage reverse gear, break out of the clay captivity. Useless. The clutches screamed, friction discs burned, filling the fighting compartment with acrid, suffocating smoke. "Kill it," Kovalev ordered. "But, Comrade Sergeant, if we—" the driver began. "Kill it," Kovalev barked. "You overheat the engine, we die right now. Oil temperature is 110 degrees. Another minute and we'll seize up." The engine sneezed and fell silent. Silence fell. A relative silence, in which the clanking of the approaching German column's tracks became distinctly audible. The sound was rhythmic, heavy, inevitable, like hammer blows on an anvil. Kovalev looked at his hands. They were black with fuel oil that had eaten into the skin so deeply it would never wash off. Fingernails broken. On the knuckles, abraded skin, dried blood. Mechanic's hands. Hands of a man accustomed to fixing what was broken. But right now, the situation could not be fixed. There were no heroes in the tank. There were exhausted men trapped in an iron barrel. The radio operator, curled into a ball, stared blankly at the radio scale. The loader bit his lips until they bled, looking through the triplex to the rear at his own guns. The driver helplessly dropped his head onto the levers. The expectation of death became physically tangible. It tasted of oxidized copper in the mouth. The cold penetrated under clothes, seizing muscles. The absence of shells made them not soldiers, but targets in a shooting gallery. A tank without ammo is just a tractor plated in steel. Useless, heavy junk. "They are close," the radio operator whispered. 500 yards. I hear them on the air. They're talking about a sleeping tank. That's us. They think we're knocked out.
"We are knocked out," the driver grunted without lifting his head. "Morally knocked out. Fuel for 10 minutes of running. Shells, 0. Grub, 0. Kovalev was silent. His gaze slid over the cramped space of the fighting compartment. Racks, breech, periscopes, fan. His gaze snagged on a corner where a 50-gallon drum was strapped down. It was non-standard equipment. An extra supply of oil. Waste oil they had drained from knocked-out vehicles to top up the eternally leaking, worn-out German engine. Thick, black sludge. A vile, viscous substance. Kovalev's brain, working in emergency overdrive mode, suddenly stopped on this object. Oil. Hot manifold. Exhaust temperature, 600 degrees Celsius. Viscosity. Flashpoint. There was no gleam of hope in the sergeant's eyes. Instead, the cold fire of calculation lit up. It was not an epiphany. It was engineering cynicism. The ability to see in a dirty barrel of waste the only chance to prolong life for a few more minutes. "Semyonov," Kovalev's voice became quiet and hard as grinding metal. 32 wrench. Fast.
"What for?"
the loader sobbed. "We aren't going to shoot." Kovalev turned to the crew. His face, smeared with soot, resembled a mask. "We have nothing to shoot with. We will make it so that no one can shoot." "What are you planning?" The driver raised his head. "Mechanic, open the floor in the engine compartment. Get to the exhaust manifold." "It's hot there, Sergeant. It's an oven." "Don't care. Semyonov, drag the hose from the oil pump. We're going to make a smoke screen." "What screen? The standard canisters ran out a week ago." "We'll make our own, Russian style, out of German crap and Russian spite." Outside, the clanking of tracks grew louder. The ground trembled. The first Tiger was crawling out of the fog like a prehistoric monster, sweeping its gun barrel from side to side. Seconds remained until contact. Kovalev looked at his watch. The glass was broken, but the mechanism was ticking. It wasn't time to die yet. It was time to work. Chances of survival trended toward absolute 0. Kovalev, an old techie who had gone through the Finnish campaign on T-26s, didn't believe in miracles. A miracle in war is a statistical error, an enemy gunner's mistake, a defective fuse, a misfire. Hoping for an error was stupid. One could only hope in iron and thermodynamics. His gaze drilled into the barrel of waste oil. 50 gallons of black, viscous sludge, a mixture of mineral oil, gasoline soot, metal shavings, and dirt. For any normal mechanic, this was garbage to be disposed of. For Kovalev, right now, it was a chemical reagent. A schematic instantly built itself in the sergeant's head. Not heroic, but strictly engineering. The standard smoke system on German tanks worked on candles located on the stern. There were no candles. But the principle remained unchanged. Thermal sublimation of a substance. Need to turn liquid into aerosol. For that, a high-temperature source is needed. The engine. The overheated Maybach 120 behind their backs was a furnace. The exhaust manifolds were glowing red.
The metal temperature there right now was around 700 degrees. If you fed oil directly onto the manifold, it wouldn't ignite with an open flame immediately if there wasn't sufficient oxygen inflow. It would instantly evaporate, expanding in volume thousands of times over. It wouldn't be smoke. It would be a heavy, greasy fog. "Engine compartment hatch!" Kovalev struck the driver's shoulder with his fist, knocking him out of his stupor. "Open the bulkhead!" The driver, Lance Corporal Zubov, looked at the commander with glassy eyes. His face was grey, his lips were trembling. He didn't hear. He was listening to the clanking of tracks outside. "Zubov!" Kovalev grabbed him by the lapels and shook him so hard the tanker's head wobbled. "You want to live, or die here like a rat? Open the engine bay!" "There's fumes. The temperature," Zubov wheezed. "Open it!" They tore off the latches of the internal bulkhead, separating the fighting compartment from the engine bay. A wave of heat hit them in the face. It was the breath of the underworld. The air here was hotter than a steam bath, saturated with gasoline vapors and scorching metal. The roar of the idling motor became deafening, drowning out even the cannonade outside. "22 wrench! And a knife!" Kovalev was no longer speaking. He was screaming right into the driver's ear, shouting over the rumble of 12 cylinders. The idea was insane. Technically, it was sabotage, a violation of every conceivable operating instruction. They were about to start a fire in their own engine compartment, hoping the exhaust fans would spit the combustion products outside rather than choke the crew inside. Zubov, whining from fear and heat, climbed into the belly of the tank. It was cramped. A tangle of tubes, rods, wires, everything hot. One wrong touch, second-degree burn. Kovalev climbed after him, dragging a rubber hose torn from the fuel transfer system. "Cut the return line!" Kovalev jabbed his finger at the oil main. "Cut it and throw the end right onto the exhaust headers." "Comrade Sergeant!" Zubov's eyes bugged out wildly. "We'll blow up. The vapors will flash. It'll be a fuel-air explosion. The cylinder block will crack. Cut it, you bastard!" Kovalev shoved a Finnish knife under his nose. "Either we blow up from their shell in a minute, or we risk burning ourselves. Choose." In the cramped, stinking hell of the engine compartment, there was no room for democracy. Only the dictatorship of survival worked here. Zubov, sobbing, slashed the reinforced hose with the knife. The black, hot blood of the machine spurted into his face. Oil. Hot. 90 degrees. He screamed, wiping his eyes with a dirty sleeve, smearing fuel oil over his face. "Pull it to the manifold!" Kovalev grabbed the hose, slippery with grease. Hands slipped. The wrench kept sliding off, tearing skin from knuckles down to the meat. But there was no pain. Adrenaline worked like morphine. Blood mixed with oil, dripping onto the scorching cylinder block, where it instantly evaporated with a hiss. It smelled of burnt flesh. Kovalev pressed the hose down, securing it with a piece of wire right above the exhaust pipe. The construction was flimsy, unreliable, assembled from trash and desperation. A typical example of field improvisation when engineering thought works on the razor's edge. "The barrel!" Kovalev commanded. "Drag the barrel to the bulkhead!" The loader and radio operator, coughing from the fumes, dragged the 50-gallon drum over. "Tip it over." "Right on the floor?" "Pour it so it flows into the sump. The pump will suck it up." They flipped the heavy barrel. Thick, stinking sludge gushed onto the ribbed floor, flooding the transmission, drive shafts, boots. It became slippery inside the tank, like on an ice rink. The stench was so bad it cut the eyes. Kovalev understood the physics of the process. Now the engine's oil pump, working at its limit, would start grabbing this filth. The pressure in the system would jump. Part of the oil would go through the cut hose, straight onto the red-hot iron. It was a game with death. The flash point of oil vapors is around 200 degrees. The manifold temperature is over 600. By all laws of physics, an explosion should occur. But Kovalev was counting on one thing: the lack of oxygen. The engine compartment was sealed. If external hatches weren't opened, the fire would simply have nothing to feed on. Instead of flame, there would be pyrolysis, decomposition, smoke. Lots of smoke. "Sergeant! Germans!" The radio operator's scream broke through the noise. "I see the lead one through the slit! 50 yards! Fans on full!" Kovalev yelled, climbing out of the engine compartment, covered in oil like a devil out of a snuff box.
"Zubov, get on the levers. The engine will seize,"
the driver shouted, taking his seat. "It won't last long on sludge." "It doesn't need to last long. It needs 2 minutes. Gas. Give it revs." Zubov floored the pedal. The tachometer needle jerked and crawled into the red zone. The engine, tortured by foreign diesel and bad maintenance, howled. It was the death rattle of the mechanism. Pistons moved at frantic speed, grinding dirt and carbon. Kovalev watched the oil pressure gauge. The needle trembled, climbing upward. The system was working. The sludge went through the tubes. A black jet struck the glowing metal of the manifold. In the first second, nothing happened. Only a hiss, like a snake's. And then the space of the engine compartment began to fill with a whitish, impenetrable murk. Not fire. Smoke. Chemistry worked. The waste oil, hitting the overheated steel, instantly transitioned into a gaseous state, breaking down into heavy hydrocarbon fractions. "Batches down!" Kovalev commanded. "It's starting." He knew what would happen next. The smoke would seek an exit. The only exit was through the ventilation system and gaps in the hull. First, it would go outside, creating a screen. But then, when the concentration became critical, it would go inside. They had driven themselves into a gas chamber. But it was their choice. Better to suffocate from their own smoke than turn into mince from a German shell. Outside, through the triplex, Kovalev saw the barrel of the Tiger slowly turning in their direction. The black pupil of the .88 caliber looked right into his face. The German gunner likely already had his finger on the electric trigger. He saw easy prey before him, a dirty, immobile, captured tank stuck in a swamp, an ideal target for target practice. The German didn't know one thing. Inside this target, Russian mechanics had just violated every law of Wehrmacht equipment operation, turning the internal combustion engine into a generator of chemical warfare. "Come on, baby, come on," Kovalev whispered, watching the smoke that began oozing from the cracks of the engine bulkhead. Hands were trembling, not from fear, from muscle overexertion. He felt sticky, cold sweat running down his back, a mixture of fear, heat, and the understanding that there was no way back. The hose was cut, no check valve. The process was now irreversible. Either they blinded the enemy, or the engine would explode, burying them all in a mass grave of alloy steel. Seconds stretched into eternity. The tar of time froze. The sound of the German engine outside became very close. The clanking of tracks drowned out the heartbeat. Kovalev wiped his oily hand on his pants, leaving black stripes on the fabric. He was ready. The crew was ready. Chemistry had entered the reaction. Engineering improvisation in hell had begun. "Kill it!" Kovalev's command wasn't heard. It was read from his white lips. Zubov yanked the fuel pump lever toward himself. The engine, which had just been howling at the limit, cut its song on a high note. The pistons, accelerated to frantic speeds, made the final inertial strokes and froze. A cottony, ringing silence fell in the fighting compartment, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a crypt, into which sounds of the outside world slowly seeped like water into a hold. First, the rain returned, a monotone drumming on the armor plates. Then, distant explosions of howitzer shells somewhere on the horizon. And finally, the main sound. A low, rolling bass that made the instrument needles on the driver's panel tremble. They were coming. Kovalev had turned the turret 180 degrees 5 minutes ago. The gun barrel looked backward, toward their own positions, lifelessly lowered.
In tanker language, this meant one thing. The machine is dead. Either abandoned, knocked out, or with broken hydraulics. It was a pose of submission, the pose of a corpse. "Sit quietly," the sergeant hissed. "Don't breathe. Blink, and even that only every other time." Complex thermodynamic processes were occurring inside the tank right now. The engine had stalled, but 1,300 pounds of cast iron and steel of the cylinder block hadn't gone anywhere. They were red hot. The oil they had pumped onto the manifolds in the last seconds of operation was now hissing and bubbling in the darkness of the engine compartment. It wasn't burning with an open flame. There wasn't enough airflow. It was smoldering. It was sublimating into a thick, greasy vapor that filled every cubic inch behind the bulkhead, creating excess pressure. They were sitting on a powder keg, only instead of powder, it was superheated oil aerosol. Through the cloudy, scratched triplex of the commander's cupola, Kovalev saw shapes emerging from the gray wall of the downpour. They were enormous. A Tiger is not just a tank. It is 57 tons of geometric perfection created for murder. Wide tracks churned the mud with a wet squelch. The Maybach 230 engine, with 700 horsepower, ran smoothly, without strain. It was a machine that knew it was the predator here. "Mama," the loader Semyonov exhaled, sliding down the turret wall to the floor, to the shell rack. "Shut up," Kovalev kicked him with his boot, not hard, but noticeably, to bring him to his senses. "They don't see us. To them, we are scrap metal." It was a psychological calculation. German tankers are professionals. They are used to assessing threats instantly. What did they see before them? A lonely Panzer IV of an early modification, sitting in a swamp up to its belly? Gun turned back, hatches closed. No track marks in front. Means it's been standing a long time. Mud on the sides is old, dried. In the optics of the German gunner, they were simply an element of the landscape. War decoration. A rusting monument to a failed offensive. No one wastes an armor-piercing shell on a corpse. The lead Tiger came right up close. Distance, 30 yards. 20. The ground under the belly of their tank began to vibrate. It was a fine, nasty trembling that made teeth chatter. The vibration transmitted through the road wheels, through the torsion bars of the suspension, straight into the spine. Kovalev saw the weld seams on the German's frontal armor, saw the square driver's hatch, saw the muzzle brake, looking like the knob of a mace. Following the lead tank, a second one crawled out of the fog. Then a Hanomag armored personnel carrier with infantry. They were funneling into the narrow bottleneck of the log road, compressing into a tight column. On the left, swamp. On the right, minefields. The only way was along the road, 3 yards from the lurking trophy. This was the moment of truth. The moment when the human nervous system experiences overloads comparable to falling from a height. The instinct of self-preservation screamed, "Run! Open the hatch and run into the forest." But the engineer's mind held the body in a steel vice. Running was impossible. They'd be cut down by machine guns in a second.
must wait. Inside the tank, it smelled of fear. It is a specific smell, a mixture of ammonia sweat and processed adrenaline. The radio operator in the corner crossed himself rapidly, moving his lips soundlessly. Zubov gripped the levers so hard his knuckles turned white as chalk. Kovalev watched the Germans. He saw the commander of the lead Tiger. He was leaning out of the hatch to his waist, officer's cap, headphones around his neck, binoculars at his eyes. He was looking forward, scanning the horizon in search of Soviet positions.
He didn't even glance at the rusty box on the side of the road.
His gaze slid over it and went further. Disdain. That was Kovalev's main weapon. They were deemed insignificant. Trash. Passing, Zubov whispered. Comrade Sergeant, they're passing. Wait. Kovalev's voice sounded hollow, like from a barrel. Let them get drawn in. The whole column must be here. The clanking of tracks was no longer outside. It was everywhere. It seemed iron was rubbing against iron right inside their heads. The grinding of tracks, the clanking of drive sprockets, the roar of motors. The German column moved confidently, arrogantly. They felt like masters of the situation. The breakthrough had succeeded. The Russians were silent. The artillery was suppressed or blind in this fog. Kovalev counted. 1 vehicle, 2 vehicles, APC, supply truck, another tank. They moved tightly, bumper to bumper, afraid to lose visual contact in the rain curtain. Ideal target. Group target. But not for a cannon.
For chaos. Inside the engine compartment, pressure was rising. The seals weren't holding. The first wisps of whitish smoke began to seep through micro cracks in the bulkhead into the fighting compartment. It smelled of burnt oil, thick, sweet, nauseating. Sergeant, there's nothing to breathe, Semyonov wheezed. Endure. Eyes began to sting. The smoke was acrid. Additives, sulfur, heavy fractions were evaporating. The chemical attack on themselves had begun ahead of schedule. Kovalev shifted his gaze to Zubov. Ready? He said quietly. Zubov nodded. His foot hovered over the starter pedal. Hand lay on the fuel lever. Now or never. The column of Germans had exposed its flank. The lead tank had already passed, exposing its vulnerable rear. The rear guard hadn't entered the kill zone yet, but the core of the column was here, right in front of them. The Germans relaxed. They had passed the dangerous section. They thought the worst was behind them.
Kovalev saw the officer on the lead tank duck into the hatch to escape the intensifying rain. The hatch lid slammed shut. Now they were blind. They saw the world only through narrow slits of optics. Zubov, Kovalev, filled his lungs with air saturated with fumes. Do it! This was not a command to attack. It was a command for the suicide of the machine, for the salvation of men. Zubov slammed the electric starter button and simultaneously floored the gas. War is not a parade, and not a heroic pose on a poster. War is when you sit in a puddle of your own urine, choking on smoke, but continue to do your job because there is no other way. In this cramped iron coffin, the fate not only of their crew was being decided, but of the entire battery behind, which these tigers would crush in 10 minutes. The starter screeched. The flywheel spun up, and in that instant, time compressed again into a tight spring, ready to uncoil with a blow to the face. The Maybach engine didn't start. It exploded with a roar. 12 cylinders, receiving an enriched mixture and a spark, struck the crankshaft with the force of a steam hammer. This was not a standard start. It was the scream of a dying mechanism forced to work beyond the bounds of physical possibility. Zubov didn't just press the starter. He mashed the gas pedal into the floor, opening the throttle butterflies fully. The carburetors drowned in fuel, pistons jerked up and down, driving the oil in the system to critical pressures. In the same second, the oil pump, snatching thick sludge from the sump, hurled it into the main line. The black blood of the machine, mixed with dirt and shavings, hit the cut hose. The jet struck the scorching cast iron of the exhaust manifold. Physics worked instantly and terribly. Thermal shock. The temperature difference between cold oil and red-hot metal was over 500 degrees. Explosive evaporation occurred. The liquid, touching the surface, didn't just boil, it annihilated, turning into gas with a monstrous rate of expansion. 1 quart of oil at such heat produces thousands of quarts of thick, dense aerosol. And there were 50 gallons of oil. The sound changed. Added to the metallic clank and roar of the motor was a sinister, hissing breath, as if a giant snake took a breath. Inside the engine compartment, pressure spiked so high the steel plating sheets bulged outward. The tank did not fire a shell. It spat blackness into the world. From all cracks of the engine compartment, from under loosely fitted hatches, from exhaust pipes, a cloud of smoke burst out. This wasn't the light blue smoke that comes from a campfire. This was a heavy, oily substance, high-density aerosol. At first, it was white, supersaturated steam. But in a split second, mixing with exhaust soot and combustion products of dirt, it turned black. The wind and rain, which a minute ago were enemies of the crew, now became allies. The damp, cold air didn't let the smoke rise. Atmospheric pressure pinned it to the ground. The cloud didn't disperse. It fell down like a heavy blanket and spread over the mud, filling lowlands, craters, and ruts. The ink blot effect. Like a cuttlefish releasing ink into water to vanish, Kovalev's tank instantly dissolved in its own exhaust. Within 3 seconds, the rear of the machine vanished. Within 5 seconds, the turret vanished. Within 7 seconds, the world around ceased to exist. The German commander of the lead Tiger, who had just slammed his hatch, saw through the triplex something that defied logic. The rusty carcass of the Soviet trophy on the roadside suddenly came alive. It didn't turn its turret, didn't open fire. It simply exploded from the inside with darkness. A black wall struck the Tiger's optics, plastering the glass with a greasy film. It wasn't smoke. It was a suspension of fuel oil. It settled on sight glasses, on vision slits, on prism observation devices as an instant, opaque film. Wipers on German tanks were not designed for this. They could wipe off water, could wipe off liquid mud, but against viscous oil film, rubber was powerless. It simply smeared grease over the glass, turning visibility from poor to zero. Zubov inside the tank was screaming from exertion, holding engine revs in the red zone. The tachometer needle was banging against the limiter, 3,000 revolutions per minute. "Hold it!" Kovalev shouted, though no one heard him. "Hold it until the pistons fly out!" The engine compartment turned into a chemical reactor. Oil poured onto the manifolds in a continuous stream. The heat capacity of the metal was enough to evaporate gallons of liquid per second. Temperature in the bay was dropping, but the process had already become self-sustaining. The scorching exhaust gases heated the mixture themselves. The cloud expanded explosively. It covered the lead German tank, swallowed it whole. The smoke crawled further, along the road, toward the column. It was as thick as sour cream. Sounds and light drowned in it. The driver of the second German tank saw only a black wall in front of him that devoured his commander's machine. Instinct worked faster than reason. A sharp slam on the brakes. 57 tons of steel slid by inertia on wet clay another 10 feet. The rear armored personnel carrier didn't react in time. The driver of the Hanomag simply drove into the dense cloud, seeing nothing, and with full momentum slammed into the rear of the stopped tank. Impact. The screech of crumpling metal. Screams of wounded infantrymen. Kovalev's tank worked as a chaos generator. It stood motionless, but its breathing destroyed the German formation order more effectively than a battery of cannons. The smoke was everywhere. It penetrated the air intakes of German machines.
Tiger engines, hungry for clean air, began swallowing oil mist. The mixture in the cylinders became over-rich. Motors began to sneeze, lose power, choke. It was technical sabotage, live on air. One malfunctioning, dying Soviet engine was killing the synchronized work of a dozen German motors. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Orientation in space was lost completely. German gunners turned sight wheels, but saw only gray-black murk. Laser rangefinders didn't exist then. Infrared devices, neither. Eyes were the only instrument, and now those eyes were gouged out. Kovalev looked at the pressure gauge. Oil pressure was dropping. The barrel was emptying. But the deed was done. Fog filled the valley. The narrow road through the swamp turned into a tunnel where blind giants bumped sides, trying to feel out the path. In the ether, which a minute ago was full of crisp commands, panic now reigned. The radio operator tore off his headphones. Screams in German were coming from there.
No one understood what was happening. Gas attack? New secret weapon? Fuel depot explosion? No one could believe that this apocalypse was arranged by one crew on scrapped metal, using ingenuity and a gross violation of safety regulations. And the oil kept pouring. Inside the fore, the temperature rose. Wiring insulation began to melt. Smoke, finding no exit outward, went inward. The fighting compartment began to fill with the same poisonous fog with which they had blinded the enemy. "Masks on!" Kovalev pulled on his gas mask. Rubber tightly gripped his face, lenses fogged instantly. Breathing became hard. The corrugated filter tube couldn't cope with the concentration of hydrocarbons. His throat tickled as if someone had poured broken glass into it. But the main thing was done. Visual contact broken. The German war machine, built on interaction and visual contact, had gone blind. Now, in this ink puddle, everyone was equal.
Both the Tiger, with its thick armor, and their cardboard fore.
Armor doesn't matter if you don't see where to shoot. Gunpowder is useless if the sight is smeared with fuel oil. Only intuition remained, and fear. Kovalev knew. Now the most terrible part would begin. Panic of armed men trapped in the dark. Disorderly firing in all directions. He put a hand on Zubov's shoulder, giving the sign, "Don't shut it off. Let it roar. Let it spew smoke to the last drop of oil, until the pistons weld in their own juice, until the connecting rods punch through the block." This sound was their only shield, and their funeral march. The fog wasn't just white or gray. It was greasy. The oil suspension bursting from the manifolds settled on German optics as a dense, opaque film. The glass blocks of vision devices turned into black mirrors. The driver of the lead Tiger, the best graduate of the tank school in Paderborn, suddenly went blind.
He did what instinct dictates, not the manual. Slammed the brakes.
But the physics of moving 57 tons of metal on wet clay generously watered with hot oil has its own laws. The coefficient of friction disappeared. Tracks locked, digging into the soil, but inertia dragged the machine forward. the tank turned into an uncontrollable sled. The left track hit the edge of the corduroy road, the log decking laid across the swamp. Logs, slippery with grease, slid apart under the monstrous weight. The multi-ton behemoth slowly, with the grace of a dying whale, tipped over. At first, the list was barely noticeable. 5 degrees, 10. The crew inside screamed, feeling the floor go out from under their feet. Then the center of gravity shifted irreversibly. The Tiger slid off the road. The heavy stern plunged into the liquid mud of the swamp, lifting the nose to the sky. The gun barrel helplessly scraped the low clouds.
The engine roared, trying to pull the machine out, but the wide tracks only churned peat into black mush, burying the tank deeper. It bottomed out. The trap snapped shut. The number 2 following him didn't see this maneuver. The solid wall of black and white smoke hid the leader's catastrophe. March distance, 15 yards. Speed, 6 miles per hour. Human reaction time, 1 second. Braking distance on oil, 5 yards. The mathematics of disaster added up instantly. The driver of the second Tiger saw the steel stern of the lead machine in front of him only when half a yard remained. The impact was dull and terrible. The sound of crumpling fenders, cracking headlights, the ring of snapped tow cables. The second tank slammed into the stuck leader with full force, jamming its turret dead with its frontal plate. A traffic jam formed. The perfect bottleneck. 2 steel fortresses, costing millions of Reichsmarks, turned into a pile of interlocked metal, blocking the only road through the swamp. The rear Hanomag APC, packed with panzergrenadiers, tried to avoid collision. The driver jerked the wheel right. Wheels slid on the sludge. The vehicle spun across the road, and it flew sideways into the smokescreen, crashing into the side of the second tank. Inside the captured 4, Kovalev heard this concert of destruction. The grinding of metal on metal sounded like music to him. "Contact!" he yelled through the rubber of the gas mask. "They linked up! They linked up, the bastards! What do we do, Sergeant?" Zubov's voice trembled with tension and laughter bordering on hysteria. "Machine guns!" Kovalev barked. "Fire! Shoot at anything that moves! So panic!" The ammo for the main caliber was empty, but the belts for the coaxial MG-34 machine gun remained full. This was their last argument.
Zubov, seeing no target, pressed the trigger of the bow machine gun. Kovalev manned the one coaxial with the cannon. Tracers cut the thick smoke with red dotted lines. They didn't aim at armor. 7.92 bullets couldn't harm Tigers. They hit optics, vision slits, antennas. But mostly, they created sound. The sound of close combat. German crews, blinded, deafened by the impact, and disoriented by smoke, perceived this unambiguously. Ambush. Russian infantry. Grenadiers. Saboteurs. Fear, locked in cramped armor, has a tendency to detonate faster than gunpowder. "Contact left!" the commander of the second Tiger yelled into the throat microphone. "Infantry! They're everywhere! Suppressive fire!" The turret of the German tank, blocked from the front, jerked. The gunner, maddened by the flashing of red tracers in the oil fog, pressed the pedal of the coaxial machine gun. A long burst lashed into the void, cutting the smoke. Bullets ricocheted off the armor of the knocked-out lead tank and scattered fan-wise. One of the ricochets struck the side of their own armored personnel carrier. The infantry in the open bed of the Hanomag didn't see who was shooting. They saw only flashes in the fog and heard the whistle of bullets overhead. "We're surrounded!" The shout of an NCO drowned in the roar. "All around defense! Fire!" 24 German submachine guns began spraying the milky veil with lead. They shot at sound, at flashes, at fear.
Chaos became absolute. Within a 50-yard radius, a mad firefight began in which no one saw the enemy. Germans were shooting each other. Tanks hammered their own infantry with machine guns. Infantry threw grenades under the tracks of their own tanks, thinking Russian sappers were there. Tracer bullets dashed about in the cloud of smoke, reflecting off armor, creating a strobe light effect. Muzzle flashes illuminated the oil mist from within with a sinister orange light.
It seemed the cloud itself was burning.
Kovalev ceased fire. He let go of the machine gun grips and leaned back against the seat backrest, breathing heavily. The gas mask filters wheezed. He didn't need to do anything else. The enemy was destroying itself. It was a chain reaction of fear. One shot spawned 10. 10 spawned 100. Germans, disciplined, trained, who had marched across all of Europe, turned into a mob of blind kittens driven into a dark room with a glue-covered floor. They lost the main thing: command and control. The company commander in the lead tank tried to restore order on the air, but his radio was clogged with screams of the wounded and panic reports.
Achtung! Feuer einstellen!
He yelled, but no one listened. The instinct of self-preservation overrode communication channels. Each crew fought for its life, with ghosts spawned by smoke from the ruptured manifold of a Russian trophy. And the engine of the four continued to run.
It was no longer howling. It was wheezing, grinding, thrashing in agony.
The temperature had crossed all conceivable limits. Oil was running out. Now pure soot was burning in the cylinders. Chunks of scale flew out of the exhaust pipes. But the smoke kept coming. The smoke was thick, dense, saving. It hid the small old tank from retribution. Kovalev looked at his watch. 3 minutes had passed. 3 minutes that cost 3 lifetimes. Outside, in this hell, someone was screaming. Grenades popped sharply. Bolts clattered. "Sergeant," the radio operator's voice sounded quiet, almost calm. "Ours... The signalman is on the line, asking what the hell is going on over here. The gunners don't understand where to hit. They see the cloud, but don't see targets." Kovalev grinned under the rubber mask. The smile came out crooked and terrible. "Give them coordinates," he said. "Grid 34, Snail 7. Reference point, black cloud. Let them pour it right into the center." "But we're
Right there, Comrade Sergeant!" The radio operator froze. "They'll cover us!"
"We're in the dead zone," Kovalev lied. Or maybe he didn't. He didn't know himself. The dispersion of a howitzer battery is an ellipse 200 by 40 yards. Chance of a direct hit, 1 in 100. Chance of survival if the Germans regain sight, 0. "Send it," he ordered. "Call fire on our position. Say, Box is in the center, holding smoke. Fire at the sound." The radio operator began tapping out Morse code with the key. Dot, dash, dot. The signal went into the ether, breaking through German cursing. And outside, chaos raged. The blind tiger tried to turn on the spot and crushed a messenger's motorcycle with its hull, the rider having unluckily ended up nearby. The crunch of the frame and the man's scream drowned in the general noise. The German military machine stalled. The gears of the mechanism, lubricated with Russian mud and engineering audacity, began to crumble, grinding each other down. Kovalev closed his eyes. Now everything was decided not by mechanics, but by ballistics. The shells should already be on their way. Heavy 122mm arguments of the god of war. He imagined them leaving the howitzer barrels somewhere in the rear, describing a high parabola in the gray sky, and beginning to fall, falling on this cloud, on this screaming, shooting tangle of steel and flesh. There was only waiting left, waiting for the sound that would drown out everything, the sound of arrival. 7 miles to the east, observation post of the artillery battery of the 152nd Howitzer Brigade. Battery Commander Lieutenant Savelyev presses the eyepieces of the trench periscope to his eyes so hard that red circles remain on the bridge of his nose. In the gray veil of rain, he sees an anomaly.
This is not a battle in the usual sense. It is a black, pulsating tumor on the body of the Rzhev swamp. A dirty, greasy cloud that lives its own life, swelling and spreading along the ground. Inside this blackness, short, angry sparks flash, either lightning or gunshots. The ether, previously clogged with static crackle and German speech, suddenly spits out clear numbers. The voice of the radio operator from the captured tank breaks through the static like a needle through fabric. Pine, this is Box. Grid 34, Snail 7. Work the center of the cloud. We are holding them. They are standing. Repeat. Target is grouped. Stationary. Armor. Infantry. Bunched up. Savelyev asks no questions. Who is in that hell? Why they are alive? And where they got a German transmitter? Questions for the special department. For an artilleryman, there are only 2 parameters: coordinates and target type. Grouped. Stationary. This is a howitzer man's dream. This isn't hunting for nimble targets. This is sledgehammer work. Battery! Savelyev's voice breaks into a falsetto, drowning out the noise of the rain. Halt! Elevation 120, level 3002. Main direction, 30. High explosive. Fuse. Fragmentation. In caponiers covered with camouflage nets, mechanisms come into motion. The barrels of 122mm M30 howitzers crawl upward slowly with the heavy whine of elevation drives. There is no hatred here. Pure mathematics. Angle of elevation, drift, wind correction, charge temperature. Loaders slam 90-pound shells into breaches with a clang. Casings with propellant charges fly in after. Heavy wedge breaches slam shut with a dry, carnivorous click. Battery! Salvo! Fire! The earth under the gun trails shudders. 4 barrels simultaneously spit flame. Recoil mechanisms dampen the monstrous energy with a hiss. Shells go into the low, leaden sky, tearing the air with a characteristic sound resembling the tearing of a bedsheet, only amplified 1,000 times. Flight time, 32 seconds. 32 seconds of silence, in which the fate of the German breakthrough is decided. In these seconds, the laws of tactics cease to apply. External ballistics comes into force. Steel pigs filled with TNT describe a high parabola, punching through clouds to plummet vertically down. Down below, in the oil mist, the Germans were still trying to feel out the enemy. The commander of the 2nd Tiger yelled at his driver, demanding he back up, but the interlocked tracks only ground away, winding up mud. Infantry, lying prone around the APC, blindly fired back at phantoms. They didn't hear the shells outgoing. The sound of arrival always comes late. First comes death, then the sound. The first shell hit 10 yards from the road, into the shaky quagmire. Explosion. A fountain of mud, water, and peat flew as high as a 5-story building. The shock wave, compressing air to the density of concrete, slammed against the sides of the German machines. The smoke hiding the column was torn apart for a moment, revealing a picture of chaos.
interlocked steel monsters, figures of people crawling in the mud. And then, the sky fell. The battery bracketed the square perfectly. The shells landed tight. The fragmentation radius of a 122 caliber is up to 60 yards. Lethal force, absolute. One of the shells landed right on the roof of the engine compartment of the rear APC. The thin armor wasn't designed for a vertical strike from a howitzer HE shell. The vehicle was simply cracked open like a tin can by a butcher's knife. The ammo explosion inside turned the Hanomag into a fireball. The men sitting inside were simply crossed off the lists of the living. They weren't torn apart. They were atomized. The heavy tanks got it differently.
A direct hit by an HE shell on a Tiger's turret doesn't always penetrate the armor. But physics can't be cheated. The kinetic energy of the impact and the detonation of 18 pounds of explosives create such an impulse that weld seams burst inside the tank. Observation devices fly out of their sockets, turning into shrapnel slashing the crew's faces. Optics crumble into dust. The crew of the lead Tiger, stuck in the swamp, received severe concussions. Blood flowed from ears and noses. The men lost orientation. They were alive, but they were no longer a combat unit. They were meat in an iron box being beaten with a sledgehammer. "Rapid fire!" Saveliev screamed into the handset, watching a fiery hell unfold in the blackness. The artillery worked like a disposal conveyor belt. Fire, recoil, eject casing, load, fire. Rate of fire, 4 rounds per minute per barrel. 16 shells per minute falling on a patch of ground the size of a soccer field. Shrapnel mowed down the infantry trying to crawl out of the trap.
In viscous mud, you can't run. You can only crawl. And a crawling man is an easy target for a fragmentation field, skimming the ground at knee height. Sergeant Kovalev's tank was in the epicenter of this storm. Only their position saved them. They stood slightly aside from the main road, in a hollow shrouded by the thickest layer of smoke. The gunners were hitting the road, the concentration of vehicles. But a shell is a fool. Fragmentation spread doesn't choose friend or foe. The earth around the four shook. The tank bounced on its road wheels. Shockwave blows struck the hull like a forge press. Inside, it was terrifying. Not like in a battle with direct visibility. It was the animal terror of a mole buried in a burrow. "Hold on!" Kovalev yelled, though no one heard him. They sat on the floor of the fighting compartment, huddled in a ball. Zubov clutched his head with his hand.
The radio operator howled, pressing his palms to his ears. The air inside was compressed by blows from outside. Every close explosion resonated with pain in all internal organs. Shrapnel drummed on the armor, a fine, nasty rattle. Ping, ping, ping. Then a heavier blow, a large chunk sheared off the external toolbox. The screech of tearing metal. If there was a direct hit, they'd just be smeared in a thin layer over the walls. No magic, no smoke would save them. But Kovalev knew. Artillery was finishing what the engineers started. It was a symphony of destruction. The smoke created by his wits trapped the Germans in a narrow corridor, deprived them of maneuver, forced them to bunch up. And the howitzers were now turning this pile into scrap metal. Without smoke, the Germans would have dispersed, gone into the forest, called in aviation, suppressed the battery with their own gunfire. Smoke made them a target. Static. Helpless. Right now, on the road, the triumph of brute force over the high technologies of the Reich was taking place. Praised German optics, radio communications, tactical training, all of this was being ground up by a mixture of Russian TNT and Rzhev mud. The lock clicked. The last shell of the series went into the barrel. Salvo! 4 explosions merged into one.
Somewhere in the center of the cloud, the ammo rack of the second Tiger detonated. The explosion was of such force that the 11-ton turret was torn off the race and hurled into the swamp like a pot lid. A pillar of fire punched through the smokescreen, rising higher than the tree crowns. Silence fell, ringing, unnatural. The shells ran out. The artillery shifted fire or went to reload. Only the crackle of burning metal, moans of the wounded, and the hiss of rain falling on red-hot debris remained. The smoke cloud, torn by explosions, slowly settled, mixing with the black, greasy soot of burning diesel and rubber.
The job was done. The hammer had fallen. The anvil held, but what was between them ceased to exist in its previous form. Kovalov raised his head. Blood was running from his nose. A continuous whine stood in his ears. He was alive. The tank was intact. The mechanics of survival had worked. Now began the chemistry of consequences. The silence outside was deceptive. The artillery barrage ended, but for the crew of the captured four, a new inner circle of hell began. The law of communicating vessels in a confined space worked flawlessly. The ventilation system of the Panzerkampfwagen 4, designed to vent propellant gases after a shot, proved powerless against the physics of the process Sergeant Kovalov had initiated. The exhaust fan on the turret roof should have ejected air outward. But when the pressure of the dense, hot oil cloud outside exceeded atmospheric pressure, the blades began working in vain. And then, the inevitable happened. Through vision device slits, through microscopic gaps in the turret race, through the shell ejection hatch, whose seal had dried out back near Smolensk, smoke went inside. It wasn't just smoke. It was a concentrated chemical reagent, a product of mineral oil pyrolysis mixed with gasoline vapors, soot, and scale. A complex cocktail of hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and acrolein, a substance used in the First World War as tear gas. The fighting compartment turned into a gas chamber of a few cubic yards. Visibility inside dropped to zero. The emergency light bulb turned into a dim yellow spot floating in a blue haze. Loader Semyonov's body gave up first. Young, unaccustomed to oxygen starvation, he tore off his gas mask. "Can't," he wheezed. "Stifling. Filter. Clogged." It was a mistake. While he breathed through the rubber tube, the charcoal filter trapped at least the large soot particles. Taking the first breath directly, he burned his larynx. The scorching aerosol scorched the mucous membrane. His throat spasmed. Semyonov doubled over, and he vomited right onto the gun breech. The vomit was black with soot. In the cramped space, where air temperature had risen to 140 degrees, the smell of gastric juices mixed with the smell of burning, creating an unbearable atmosphere of nausea. Kovalyev felt his own lungs turning into two lead bags. Every breath was a battle. A hoop squeezed his chest. His head was splitting from pulsating pain in the temples, a sure sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. Blood hemoglobin bonded with carbon monoxide, ceasing to carry oxygen. The brain began to die, slowly, cell by cell. Down below, in the driver's seat, it was worst of all. Lance Corporal Zubov sat closest to the red-hot engine bulkhead. Thermal radiation from the engine, which had finally seized dead, roasted his back even through his quilted jacket. Zubov didn't scream. He simply stopped moving. His head fell onto the vision block. Kovalev, overcoming cottony weakness in his legs, slid off the commander's seat. He had to check the crew. This wasn't heroism, but functional duty. A dead driver is a problem. Alive but unconscious, also a problem. The floor was slippery. The oil they had spilled mixed with condensate and vomit.
Kovalev crawled by touch, navigating by memory. He felt Zubov's shoulder, shook him. The body was limp, like a sack of grain. Kovalev tore off his helmet and put fingers to his neck. There was a pulse, rapid, thready, panic-stricken. The heart was trying to pump poisoned blood, but failing. Zubov was in a deep faint. Heat stroke plus acute intoxication. Air, the radio operator groaned from behind. Sergeant, open the hatch, for Christ's sake. Open. The radio operator, losing his mind from suffocation, reached for the latches of the side turret hatch. His fingers, trembling and weak, scratched the steel, trying to throw the lever.
The instinct of self-preservation demanded oxygen, at any cost.
Kovalev turned around. Rage was the only thing giving him strength to move. He knew, if the hatch opened now, they would be killed. Outside, in the fog, live Germans could still be there. Wehrmacht infantry, surviving the shelling, were shooting at anything that moved right now. Or worse, shrapnel from late shells was still whistling in the air. Kovalev struck the radio operator on the hands. Hard, backhand. "Don't dare," he rasped. His voice sounded like rusty hinges grinding. "Don't dare open." "Nothing to breathe," the radio operator sobbed, smearing black tears over his face. "We'll die here. We'll boil." Better to boil than a bullet in the forehead. "Endure. Everyone endure." It was torture by time. Seconds dragged like tar. They sat in an iron box that cooled slower than a Russian stove. The engine behind the partition continued to give off accumulated heat. The hull metal was hot to the touch. Sweat poured in streams, but it didn't cool. Humidity in the tank was 100%. Clothes stuck to bodies, turning into a wet compress. Eyes stung so bad it felt like sand with acid had been poured into the sockets. Tears flowed continuously, but brought no relief. It was chemical damage to the mucous membrane. Wartime conjunctivitis. Kovalev slumped his back against the gun guard. He felt consciousness starting to drift away. Multicolor circles swam before his eyes. Purple, green, black. Hypoxia hallucinations. He thought he heard his children's voices. Then, the clanking of tracks. Then, silence. He forced himself to pinch his leg. Pain returned reality. Reality was simple. They had won the fight, but lost their health. The price of their ingenuity, burned lungs. Toxic smoke did its job. It destroyed alveoli, leaving scars that would stay with them for life. If that life lasted even another hour. "Drink," Semenov whispered. There was no water. Canteens were empty.
There was only technical water in the cooling system, but it was boiling and mixed with antifreeze. Poison. Silence. "Save oxygen," Kovalev whispered. He understood they were on the edge. Another 5 or 10 minutes in this mode, and irreversible changes in the cerebral cortex would begin. Pulmonary edema. Death by suffocation in their own tank. Twist of fate. Not burn, not explode, but simply suffocate from the products of their own exhaust. Kovalev crawled to the triplex, wiped the glass with a finger. Outside was slightly lighter. Wind was dispersing the smoke. Rain pinned the chemistry to the ground. Shooting had died down. Only rare, single shots were audible. Someone finishing off wounded or checking weapons. Whose shots? Ours? Germans? Risk. Kovalev made a decision. Zubov! Zubov, wake up! He shook the driver again. He groaned. Alive. Semenov! Kovalev commanded, gathering the remnants of his will into a fist. Help! Pull him out. We're opening up." "And if Fritz is there?" The loader's voice trembled. "Then we die fast. Otherwise, we die slow. Move!" Together, coughing and stumbling, they dragged the unconscious body of the mechanic to the commander's hatch. In the cramped turret of the fore, this was an acrobatic stunt. Feet slipped on greasy sludge. Hands didn't obey. Muscles were clogged with lactic acid. Kovalev braced his shoulder against the hatch lid. The heavy steel plate, weighing over 100 pounds, seemed like an immovable rock to him. Latches clanked. He leaned with all his weight, squeezing the last remnants of strength out of himself. The hatch yielded with a creak. Light hit the crack. Gray, dim, rainy light of an autumn day. But most importantly, air. A stream of cold, damp air smelling of swamp and TNT burst inside. Compared to the hell inside, this was ambrosia. Kovalev took a breath. Cold burned his lungs. He coughed, spitting out black phlegm. But it was air. Oxygen. Life. He stuck his head out. The picture that opened to him resembled a landscape from another planet. Black, scorched earth, skeletons of trees looking like burnt matches, and iron. Twisted, torn, smoking iron of Tigers and APCs. The fog was dissipating. 50 yards from the tank, in the mud, bodies in gray uniforms lay. There was no movement. The Germans, whoever survived, had crawled away or were dead. Kovalev pulled himself up on his arms and tumbled onto the armor. He fell face down on the wet, cold metal of the turret. Rain beat on the back of his head. He never thought just water from the sky could bring such pleasure. Semyonov's head appeared from the hatch next. He greedily gulped air like a fish thrown on shore. Then together they pulled Zubov out, laid him right on the engine deck roof, which was still warm. The radio operator climbed out himself, slid down the armor into the mud, and lay there, arms spread, looking at the sky. They were black. Faces, hands, clothes, everything covered in a layer of oily soot. Only whites of eyes and teeth shone on these masks. Miners climbing out of a collapse. Demons escaped from hell. Kovalev tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He sat, leaning against the commander's cupola. Hands shook with a fine tremor. He looked at his palms. The skin was red, inflamed under the layer of dirt. Chemical burn. Blood started flowing from his nose again. He wiped it with a sleeve, smearing it over his cheek. "Alive," he wheezed. The words sounded alien, as if in a foreign language. Under him, the tank ticked quietly with cooling metal. The Panzer had died finally. The engine was destroyed, wiring burned. But the crew was here, wounded, poisoned, stunned, but alive. The engineering task was completed. The price paid in health. The calculation proved correct. It only remained to understand if they would ever be able to breathe fully again, without this leaden taste of burnt oil in the throat. The battlefield was cooling. In a literal, physical sense. Air temperature 39 degrees, rain with intervals of wet snow. But the earth smoked. 8 carcasses of German equipment scattered across the swamp worked like giant pot-belly stoves, giving off accumulated combustion heat into the cold atmosphere. The Tigers didn't leave. Those that didn't burn immediately from a direct howitzer hit got stuck in the sludge, blinded by smoke and panic, and were finished off by methodical fire from the Soviet battery. 8 units of armor. A Wehrmacht graveyard on a patch of 200 square yards. Master Sergeant Kovalev's captured Panzer wasn't driving. It stood as a monument to itself in the center of this composition. The engine, having committed thermal suicide, cooled and turned into a single lump of fused metal. Pistons welded to cylinder liners,
crankshaft warped. It was no longer a machine, but 30 tons of dead iron. The crew didn't crawl out.
They fell out of the hatches. Men looking like miners after a methane explosion, black faces shining with oil film, whites of eyes, red from burst vessels. They coughed as if trying to spit out their own lungs. The cough was dry, barking, wheezing. It was the remnants of acrolein and soot coming out. Infantry was already running toward them. Gray greatcoats, bedrolls over shoulders, Mosin rifles with fixed bayonets. Soldiers looked at the black, soot-covered tank with superstitious horror. It didn't look like a combat vehicle. It looked like a piece of coal pulled from a locomotive furnace. No paint remained on the armor, only a finger-thick layer of soot. Even the stars painted with lime had vanished under this coating. But the main meeting was ahead. Half an hour later, a Willys Jeep drove up to the tank. A man got out. Dry uniform, Sam Brown belt creaking with new leather. Cap with a cornflower blue band sits perfectly, without a single wrinkle. Breeches pressed. Boots shine despite the mud. Evident he walked only a couple of yards from the car. Authorized representative of the Special Department, Senior Lieutenant of State Security. He didn't look at the German corpses. He looked at the crew and the tank. His gaze was professional, scanning, looking for discrepancies. Kovalev stood leaning on the track. Legs wouldn't hold him. Head spinning from oxygen poisoning. The sharp transition from suffocation to fresh air hit the brain harder than vodka. The counterintelligence officer walked right up. He smelled of expensive Kazbek tobacco and Chypre cologne. This smell of cleanliness hit Kovalev in the nose, causing a new wave of nausea. The contrast was monstrous. Two worlds, the world of the trench louse and the world of the paper report. "Sergeant Kovalev?" The officer's voice was quiet, ingratiating, not commanding. That's how doctors in the morgue speak, or investigators before a firing squad article. "Yes, sir," Kovalev wheezed. Voice didn't obey. Vocal cords were burned. The officer slowly walked around the tank. He ran a gloved finger along the hull, removed a layer of greasy soot, looked at the glove with disgust. Then he walked up to the gun. The weapon looked at the ground. Muzzle brake was clean. The officer put a palm on the barrel, held it a second, removed the hand. "Cold," he stated. It sounded like a verdict. "Barrel is ice cold. No carbon on the muzzle brake." He turned to Kovalev. There was no malice in the officer's eyes. In them was a weary certainty that before him were more cowards. The battle lasted 40 minutes. Artillery fired 2 loads. Germans lost 8 machines. And your tank, Sergeant, stands cold. You didn't fire a single shot. "No ammo," Kovalev squeezed out. "Suppose machine guns?" The officer nodded at the bow gun. "Jacket is cold too. You fired at the start, yes. But then, when the Germans came right up? Why are you alive, Sergeant?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. In war, survival in a hopeless situation was often equated to treason. If you are won against a company of tigers and remained alive, and the enemy didn't pass, it means either you're a hero or you made a deal with them. Or hid. "We," Zubov began, but coughed, bending double. Black saliva sprayed from his mouth. Silence. The officer didn't even raise his voice. "I am asking the commander. Why is the machine intact? Why didn't you engage? Cowardice? Decided to sit it out in the smoke while artillery works?" This was tribunal logic. Cold gun means sabotage. Smoke means camouflage for desertion. Kovalev didn't make excuses. He had no strength for words. Words weighed nothing here.
Only metal carried weight. He silently pushed off the track. Staggering, he walked to the tank's stern. "Here, look," he hissed. The officer grimaced fastidiously, but followed. Kovalev pointed a hand at the open engine compartment hatch. "Look, inside."
The officer looked into the machine's belly and froze. There, in the depths, heat still stood, but it was not the heat of a working mechanism. It was a picture of a technological catastrophe. The Maybach engine no longer existed as a unit. It was a shapeless pile of melted aluminum and cast iron. High-voltage wires had flowed down in frozen plastic snot. Rubber hoses vanished, leaving only charred clamps. Manifolds were white with scale, a sign of extreme overheating. And most importantly, everything was flooded with a sintered black crust. Everywhere. On the walls, on the floor, on the remains of carburetors. And the smell. Sharp chemical smell of burnt synthetics and dead metal that even the officer's cologne couldn't overpower. "What is this?" the officer asked, recoiling slightly. "It's our weapon." Kovalev poked a finger at the homemade hose still sticking out, wired to the manifold. The wire had blackened but held. Oil. 50 gallons. Into the exhaust. The counterintelligence officer wasn't a fool. He was Cheka, but they were trained well. He understood machinery. He shifted his gaze from the melted engine to the black faces of the tankers, then to the field littered with German tanks that had collided with each other. The puzzle in his head clicked. Cold gun. Black smoke reported by observers. Blind Germans. Burned motor. "You let oil into the manifold?" he asked again. Something new appeared in his voice. Not respect, no. Surprise. As if he saw a man drive a nail with his head and stay alive. "You realize you could have exploded. Those are vapors." "I realize." Kovalev nodded. "I am an engineer." "Engineer," the officer chuckled. He took out a clean handkerchief and wiped his nose, trying to get rid of the burning smell. "Engineer Kovalev. So, didn't fight with the gun. Fought with physics." The dialogue stalled. Red Army regulations did not provide for destroying the enemy by creating a smokescreen at the cost of destroying entrusted materiel. Formally, Kovalev put the tank out of action. Intentional damage to military property. Execution. But in fact, the breakthrough was stopped. The officer looked at Kovalev. He didn't see a hero from a poster before him. He saw a deadly tired man in an oil-soaked jacket who could barely stand on his legs. "Documents," the officer threw out shortly. Kovalev reached into his tunic pocket, took out his Red Army book. It was damp, soaked with sweat and condensate, but the ink hadn't run. The officer opened it with 2 fingers, trying not to soil his gloves. "Sergeant Kovalev, assigned to the separate tank battalion, which hasn't existed for 2 days." "We exist," Kovalev said quietly. "The crew exists." "Crew?" The officer snapped the book shut and returned it. "All right. Consider I didn't see this." He nodded at the burned engine. "We'll process it on paper as a combat loss from enemy artillery fire. Direct hit in the engine transmission compartment. Tank written off, beyond repair." It was mercy, the highest mercy a man with cornflower blue collar tabs was capable of. He didn't sew a sabotage case. He just wrote off the iron. "And the feet?" suddenly asked the radio operator, who was sitting on the armor, dangling his legs. "Comrade Commander, we got them. We got 8 of them." The officer looked at the radio operator with a cold, glassy gaze.
What feat? He asked in an even voice. A feat is throwing your chest on an embrasure or a burning ram. And what do you have? Connected a pipe with a hose? That, soldier, isn't a feat. That is partisan work. Amateur hour. He turned on his heels, boots squelched in the mud. To the hospital, he threw over his shoulder. All 4, check the lungs. And I don't want to hear about oil again.
The report will say, attack repelled by artillery fire supported by tank ambush. That's it. The officer walked to his willies. His back was straight as a ramrod. He carried away the smell of cleanliness and bureaucratic correctness. Kovalev watched him go. He felt no resentment. Resentment is an emotion for peacetime. Now he felt only relief. They wouldn't be shot. He stroked the cold armor of the tank. Rough, dirty steel. Well, that's it, brother, he whispered to the machine. Served your time. The tank clicked with cooling metal, as if agreeing. It was dead. Its heart, the Maybach, baked into a monolith. But the crew was alive. Kovalev looked at his hands. Black fuel oil had eaten into the skin so deep it seemed it was now part of his DNA. It wasn't a medal. It was a stamp. A stamp that they survived where they should have died, cheating death with a wrench and the laws of thermodynamics. And in the reports, only artillery would remain. Cannons have a bigger caliber. They need it more. Zubov, get up. Kovalev kicked the driver's boot. Need to move. Med station is 2 miles. We'll walk. Slowly, supporting each other, they trudged away from the Black Monument, leaving behind the iron graveyard and their war, about which no one would ever truthfully write. 3 days later in the rear, at the assembly point of the Repair and Restoration Battalion, the rain was just as gray and indifferent as on the front line. The difference was only in sound. Here, they didn't shoot. Here, sledgehammers banged and grinding wheels squealed. The air smelled not of gunpowder, but of acetylene and damp shavings. The captured Panzer was dragged here on tow by 2 Voroshilovets tractors. The tank's tracks were locked, and it plowed 2 deep furrows in the mud, as if resisting, not wanting to leave the place of its death. Now it stood by a barbed wire fence, black, peeling, looking like the skeleton of a prehistoric animal. Near the engine compartment, 2 technicians in greasy overalls were bustling. They had already removed the upper armor plates and were now studying the cause of the machine's death with the interest of pathologists. Sergeant Kovalev stood nearby. He was clean-shaven, uniform washed, but the oil stains on his hands hadn't washed off. They had eaten into the pores, becoming a second skin. "You really did a number, Sergeant." An elderly military technician second class wiped his hands with a rag and spat at his feet. "I've only seen this in strength of materials textbooks, in the section Thermal Deformation of Critical Nodes. You didn't just burn it, you fused it." The technician tapped the cylinder block with a wrench. The sound was dull, not ringing. Block cast iron diffused with piston aluminum. Crankshaft warped like a screw. Bearings evaporated. "Nothing to restore here. It's a monolith, a monument to German metallurgy." Kovalev was silent. He knew this verdict. He knew it back when he ordered Zubov to cut the hose. "What if we replace the engine?" he asked for form's sake. "You have a trophy fund?" "We do," the technician nodded. 3 3s and 2 4s, all smashed. Engines needed as donors for running machines. "And your hull?" "Warped from temperature. Geometry violated. Turret jams on the race now. If we put a new engine in there, it won't be a tank, but a mass grave." The technician took out a notebook, put a fat cross on the page with an indelible pencil.
written off, to salvage, remove optics if intact, machine guns, road wheels. The rest, to the open hearth, for remelting. This was the dry accounting of war. A tank is not a combat comrade, not a friend, and not a living being. It is an inventory number, a resource, a set of alloy steel, rubber, and copper. While it shoots and drives, it is valuable. As soon as repair cost exceeds the cost of producing a new shell, it becomes trash. Kovalev looked at his machine. He felt no sentimental sadness. He felt emptiness. This piece of iron saved their lives. It died honestly, using up its resource in 3 minutes of extreme load. It was a worthy death for a mechanism. An adjutant from the formation staff walked up to them. In his hands, a folder with papers. Sergeant Kovalev's crew? Yes, sir. Kovalev stood at attention. Zubov, Semyonov, and the radio operator stood nearby. They looked better than 3 days ago, but coughing still tore at their chests. Lungs cleared slowly. Battalion order. The adjutant didn't even look at them, he read the paper. Due to absence of materiel and high losses in rifle units, Kovalev tensed. He knew this wording. It meant the end of a tanker's career. Privates Zubov, Semyonov, and Nechayev directed to the disposal of the 246th Rifle Regiment to replenish marching companies. Silence hung, heavy, sticky. Marching company. Infantry. Queen of the fields, living on average 2 attacks. For a tanker, this was a death sentence. To descend from armor into trench mud. Swap levers and periscopes for a Mosin rifle and an entrenching tool. Lose the protection of 50 millimeters of steel. Zubov turned white. Comrade Lieutenant, I'm a first-class driver. I can rebuild a diesel with my eyes closed. Why infantry? No tanks, soldier. The adjutant raised tired eyes. Ural's factories are delivering the plan, but trains are going to Stalingrad. Here, near Rzhev, we fight with what we have, and we only have people. Receive orders and dry rations. Truck leaves in an hour. Zubov slumped. His shoulders dropped. Hands, used to feeling the vibration of a multi-ton machine, now hung helplessly along his body. He became a small man in a big greatcoat. Consumable material. War devoured resources with a monstrous appetite. Engine burned, tank to scrap. Tanks ran out, crews to infantry. Meat grinder logic. No emotions, only expediency of the moment. And Sergeant Kovalev?
The adjutant asked, shuffling papers.
Kovalev. You two to the 246th. Platoon commander. Kovalev stepped forward. This was the moment when one had to fight not a German tank, but Soviet bureaucracy. And here, too, ingenuity was needed. No, sir, he said firmly. The adjutant raised his eyebrows in surprise. What do you mean, no, sir? It's an order. Want a tribunal? I am an engineer, Kovalev said calmly. Before the war, chief mechanic of a shop. Specialty, hydraulics, and strength of materials. In a tank, I am useful. In infantry, I am one bayonet. In a week, I'll be killed, and my knowledge will rot in a crater. And what do you propose? There are no tanks, I said. Sappers, Kovalev cut in. Combat Engineer Battalion. I know German equipment, know how they mine, understand detonators, can calculate load-bearing structures of bridges for demolition. In the sappers, I'll be 10 times more useful than in a rifle line. The adjutant thought. He looked at Kovalev, assessing. Before him stood not a frightened boy, but a mature man with a hard, heavy gaze. A techie. Such people in war are rare goods. There are many bayonets, but literate engineers capable of calculating a charge to blow a pillbox are few. Education? Kharkov Polytechnic. The adjutant sighed, took out a pencil, and corrected something in the list. All right, sappers are empty right now too. They need people with brains. I'll write a report for transfer to the 109th Engineering. But note, Sergeant, sappers' lives aren't sugar either. They mistake once. I know, Kovalev nodded. At least it's work in my specialty. Need to think. The crew's farewell was short. No hugs, no tears. War weaned them off tactile contact. They stood near the dead tank. 4 men who 3 days ago sat in one iron womb, breathed one poisonous smoke, and looked into one death. Now their paths diverged forever. Zubov extended a hand. The palm was cold and rough.
Goodbye, Sergeant. Thanks for pulling us out back then.
Live, Zubov. Don't stick your neck out. I'll try. Semyonov and Nechayev nodded silently. They were already mentally there, in the trenches, trying on the fate of infantrymen. Doom could be read in their eyes. They threw kit bags over their backs and trudged to the trucks standing at the edge of the parade ground. The 1.5-ton trucks were already growling engines, spitting blue smoke. Kovalev remained alone. He turned to the tank. Technicians had already started dismantling. Oxyacetylene cut the hatch hinges. Sparks rained on the dirty ground. The machine was dying a second time. First they took its soul, the engine. Now they were taking the body. Kovalev ran a hand over the armor plate. Cold, dead metal. It was just a tool, a hammer with which they drove a nail into the lid of the German offensive. The hammer broke. It is being thrown away. There was no tragedy in this. There was the truth of war.
Kovalev adjusted his belt, tightened his bedroll. Ahead was new work. Mines, IEDs, wire, engineer reconnaissance. Physics was needed there too. Thinking before cutting was needed there too. He turned and walked toward the Sapper Battalion HQ. His steps were heavy, confident, steps of a man who knows that iron is just iron, and life continues as long as the brain works. And behind, under the hiss of the cutting torch, captured number 412 was turning into a pile of scrap metal to become part of the irrevocable loss statistics for October 1942. The dry summary of the operational department of the 30th Army Staff for October 29, 1942, fit on half a typewritten sheet. The paper was gray, cheap, with wood shavings embedded. The text, bureaucratic, devoid of adjectives and emotions. In grid 34-7, the enemy, with forces up to a tank company, supported by motorized infantry, attempted a breakthrough at the junction of rifle units. By fire of howitzer artillery and small arms, the attack was repelled. The enemy lost 8 units of armored vehicles and up to a platoon of manpower. The situation is restored. In this document, there was not a word about oil. Not a word about a cut hose, about crankcase pressure, about acrolein fumes. The names of Kovalev, Zubov, Semyonov, and Nechayev did not make it into the summary. For military bureaucracy, their actions did not exist. Moreover, from the point of view of regulation logic, what happened qualified as misuse of equipment and partisan methods. The Army is a system working on orders and manuals. In the manual for operating a captured T-4 tank, German Panzerkampfwagen 4, there is no clause, creation of smokescreen by destroying the engine. Therefore, the feat dissolved in the ink of staff clerks. It was written off to effective artillery work. Cannons, that's understandable. Cannons, that's according to regulations. But ingenuity, that's a variable value that cannot be put on rations or accounted for in ammo expenditure logs. But history is not written only on paper. It is written on the earth. Rzhev swamps know how to keep secrets, but they are also the most honest museums of war. That very section of the log road where German tigers went blind and devoured themselves remained a scar on the forest's body. 8 German carcasses were never pulled out. They were too heavy, and the quagmire too greedy. They slowly sank, immersing in peat year after year. First road wheels vanished, then hulls, and finally, only turrets with crosses stuck out of the moss like tombstones to the ambitions of Henschel designers. And on the edge of this equipment graveyard, where solid ground ended and fatal swamp began, lay the carcass of the captured 4. Repair battalion techs, having stripped it for parts, took everything valuable. Machine guns, optics, wheels, even cut off hatches for remelting. Only the tub of the hull and the turret with the jammed race remained. Dragging this useless scrap to the rear made no sense. Tractors were needed by the living. It was simply pushed by a bulldozer into the ditch. There it remained, rusty, gutted, with black traces of soot inside that didn't wash off with rains for another 10 years. It lay opposite its victims, mighty, technically perfect tigers. It was an allegory of the whole war frozen in metal. On one side, gloomy Teutonic genius, precise optics, thick armor, powerful engines, calibrated tactics, a deadly machine working like a clock. On the other side, a rusty, alien, broken mechanism inside which sat Russian men driven into a corner. And the winner was not the one with more millimeters of steel on the forehead. The winner was the one whose neurons in the brain fired faster than a gun breech. War is not a competition of tables of tactical and technical characteristics. If numbers won, the Wehrmacht would have marched in parade on Red Square back in 41. War is a collision of will and intellect in conditions incompatible with life. Heroism here is not a beautiful pose against the backdrop of an unfurled banner. Heroism is the ability to think when the brain melts from animal terror. It is the ability to see in a barrel of waste oil not trash, but a weapon of strategic importance. It is engineering improvisation in hell. Kovalev and his crew invented nothing new. They simply remembered the ancient law of survival of the Russian soldier. If you have no club, take a stone. If no stone, throw a handful of sand in the eyes. This thread stretches through centuries, from the grandfather who shoved a potato into the exhaust pipe of the master's car in the Civil War, to mechanic Zubov cutting the oil supply hose near Rzhev, and further, to those who will weld grates onto armor in the 21st century. Weapons change. Physics remains. The principle, necessity is the mother of invention, is not about poverty. It is about an asymmetric response, about how to break the enemy's ideal, expensive, complex scenario with one simple, cheap, and insane solution. The tank carcass gradually became overgrown with grass. A birch bush grew through the punctured manifold. Roots entangled that very cylinder block that once glowed white-hot, saving 4 lives. Nature took the iron back, digesting oxides and fuel oil. But in the villages around Rzhev, a legend circulated for a long time. Not about an artillery barrage, and not about a tank duel. Old men told how one autumn in 42, a black cloud rose from the swamp in which German tanks went mad and tore out each other's throats. They spoke of devil's fog and the oil witch. Mysticism replaced physics, where people couldn't understand the essence of what happened. But there was no mysticism. There was thermodynamics,
There was the process of hydrocarbon pyrolysis. There was the viscosity of mud and the ballistics of a howitzer shell. And there was Master Sergeant Kovalev, an engineer who saw the world not as a set of terrible threats, but as a set of technical tasks requiring solution. He survived, went through the war as a sapper, built crossings under fire, demined cities, returned to the factory, restored shops. He never wore medals for that battle, because medals weren't given.
But every time he smelled burnt machine oil,
At a tractor station or in a garage, he froze for a second. This smell was dearer to him than any orders. It was the smell of life, the smell of the victory of reason over death. History forgets details. It loves broad strokes. Front breached, city taken, enemy defeated. But real war is woven from millions of such microscopic details. From a nut tightened in the frost, from the last liter of diesel, from a homemade smokescreen that made 4 doomed men immortal for 3 minutes. The rusty carcass in the swamp rotted away and vanished. But the principle remained. As long as a soldier is capable of thinking outside the box, as long as an engineer sees an exit where the manual sees a dead end, this army cannot be defeated. It can be killed, but not broken. Because armor is just iron, and people make it a weapon.